Hi, I'm Brian with BibleStudying.net, and we've been talking about Zoroaster and looking at some of the figures for dating Zoroaster and how we do that historically and seeing some of the deficiencies already. Specifically, we saw that the earliest evidence that Zoroastrian ideas, particularly its most basic concept of dualism, the evidence that that was present in Western Iran, where the seat of the empires were, wasn't until the middle of the 4th century BC. So this is, as we said, some almost 400 years after the first deportation of the Jews to the area. Plenty of time for the Jewish ideas to disperse and impact Zoroaster. Now let's talk a little bit more about the documentation for Zoroastrianism. What we find is that the oldest portion, as Britannica says, doesn't date from much earlier than the 5th century BC. So here's what Britannica says. It says that the Yash, which are among the oldest portions of the Zoroastrian religious texts, though they are touched up with Zoroastrian terminology and ideas, have little to do with anything specifically Zoroastrian. So some of the oldest portions of Zoroastrian texts don't really have much to do with Zoroastrianism, therefore don't provide much evidence for Zoroastrianism from their time frame. It says that the gods who were invoked in those texts are essentially the gods of pre-Zoroastrian Iran. And it says it's not possible to date the Yash much precisely, except to believe that their redaction, although perhaps their composition, may have first taken place in the 5th century BC. So if the Jews arrived first in the 8th century, then they arrive again in the second deportation in the 6th century, and now we don't have documentation for Zoroastrianism potentially until the 5th century, another 100 years later. But there's additional problems for Zoroastrianism. Number one, we need to talk about this group called the Sasanian dynasty and what its dates are. They date from 224 to 651. This is an ancient Iranian dynasty, and they were destroyed by the Arabs in the 7th century. And so what do the Sasanians have to do with Zoroastrianism? Well, it seems that they have a lot to do concerning the religious documentation, the historical documentation we have for this religion. According to Britannica's article on the Avesta, which is the sacred book of Zoroastrianism, containing the teachings of Zoroaster, the voluminous manuscripts of the originals are said to have been destroyed when Alexander the Great conquered Persia. Alexander the Great, apparently in the 4th century, destroyed all of the existing texts, providing historical documentation for who Zoroaster was, what he believed, why those beliefs perhaps were held, were destroyed in the 4th century. So where do we get our current understanding of Zoroastrianism? Where do we get our current religious text for Zoroastrianism? Well, it goes on to say that the present Avesta was assembled from remnants and standardized under the Sasanian kings somewhere in the 3rd to the 7th centuries AD. So the Jews being deported in 721 to Assyria, and then a second time in 586 BC under the Babylonians. And now the first texts that we have for Zoroastrianism historically come from the 3rd to the 7th centuries AD. So quite a long period of time there, especially when we're asking whether or not Zoroastrianism could have influenced Judaism. It seems that we don't have any historical documentation that would allow us to corroborate that. In fact, the reverse seems to be true, that the Jews were present with their religious ideas long before we have any writings talking about who Zoroaster was and what Zoroastrians believed. The next quote here is even more, well, it's another significant point. Talking about Zoroastrianism, it says, Islam wins a decisive victory in 635 over the armies of the last Sassanid. What happens as a result? Zoroastrianism fomented rebellion and brought persecutions upon itself. So the Muslims have come in, they've taken over, they've destroyed the Sassanid kings, and now they're dominating the area, and Zoroastrianism is causing rebellion. And so the result here is that books were produced to save the essentials of the religion from a threatened disaster, but the disaster occurred nonetheless. And so in addition to having been destroyed by Alexander the Great in the 4th century, the historical texts for Zoroastrianism, what they believed, were also again heavily destroyed after being compiled by the Sassanids. And as a result of that, what's the current status? Well, the current status is that, according to Britannica, the sources of knowledge for the Avesta have endured editing and redaction at several points in their history. And according to the Columbia Encyclopedia, the Avesta consists of fragmentary and much corrupted texts. And in addition, from Britannica states that the Avesta that we now have represents only a fragment of what remained in the 9th century of the late Sasanian Avesta, compiled under the direction of one of the kings of the Sassanids in AD 531 to 579. So even what we have today is only a fragment of a 6th century version of the Avesta that had been destroyed afterwards and even before by almost, I guess, 800 years or more from Alexander the Great. So in terms of the documentation that we have, when we ask, how can we know what is true about Zoroastrianism? Was Zoroaster a historical figure? What did he actually teach as opposed to what other people added on later that may not have been from him? And what reasons do we have? What evidence may corroborate those beliefs? The historical documentation that we would use as a basis for answering those questions is not much. There isn't much there. It's very late dating. It's very far removed from Zoroaster, and it's much farther after the arrival of the Jews, who arguably kick-started a reformation, including Zoroaster himself, who was there at a time after the Jews and started creating changes in his own religion, most likely, I think, based upon the monotheism brought in by the Jews. Zoroaster starts emphasizing a more monotheistic and sort of dualistic concept of a polytheistic society. And so that's where we find the point spread after we look at the comparison between Zoroastrianism and Judaism. And so I want to sort of continue from here and talk a little bit about the next group, the next religious group, which is Jainism. And so as we talk about Jainism, and then we're going to talk about Buddhism and Ajivika as well, let's set some sort of basic historical summaries here concerning Hinduism. Because I've talked about Hinduism having a reformation at this period of time, and we've looked at Zoroaster as the first reformer of Hinduism, and that this reformation is possibly being kickstarted by the inflow of the Jews with their religious texts a couple centuries earlier. And so let's see what some summary statements have from Britannica. In their article on Hinduism, it says, Hinduism arose from continued accretion from outside sources and from the geniuses of individual reformers at all periods. Well, who are some of these reformers? And the next quote here from Columbia Encyclopedia says concerning Hinduism that an ossified Brahmanism was challenged by heterodox, i.e. non-Vedic systems, notably Buddhism and Jainism. And so Buddha and Jainism, and other quotes here talk about Jainism, Ajivika, and Buddha. These are some of the prominent reformers. But you notice that these are reformers. This isn't a new religion being put forward that we have to test as though it's a brand new revelation. This is an old religion. This is Hinduism being reformed the same way that Lutheranism or Presbyterianism or even the Church of England are reformed or denominations of Christianity. It's the same religion. It's just a different sect within it. And that's how we have to analyze these particular points of view concerning Hinduism and Buddhism and Jainism. So let's talk a little bit here about Jainism. And in fact, I want to sort of put this on pause for a moment. We'll come back and we'll take a fresh start after a break with Jainism and the historical detail for it.